Hello and welcome to the Strong Suit Podcast, where we focus on the people part of your business. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I interview a world-class expert on talent and recruiting so that you can build a company filled with rock stars. I'm joined today by a fascinating guest who has built not one, but two successful companies. One was a centralized company, all his staff in one location. Now he's at it again, venture capital funded, this time completely a distributed model company. So the staff is all over the world. For the next 20 minutes, Thejo Kote is going to help me understand the pros, the cons, how to compare and contrast, and how, frankly, to decide what you should do when it comes to the structure of your company, whether it should be centralized or decentralized. So with that, Thejo, welcome to the show.
Jeff, thanks for having me.
It is great to have you, and I appreciate you making the time. You're the founder of Airbase. Why don't we spend just a couple minutes on the company just to set the context, and then we're going to talk about the people part. So as I understand it, Airbase is really around spend management. So companies spend. You're obviously focused on B2B. Is this a SaaS platform, I assume, or is it some other kind of model?
It is a SaaS product, and we're essentially an all-in-one platform for spend management, right? So, and this is something I faced building my first company, and I'm solving that problem. And anybody who runs a company, they understand that once it gets to a certain stage, the process of just figuring out what you're spending money on and controlling it and getting visibility into it is hugely painful, right? So you have, requests and approvals happening in systems like Slack and email, and all the payments happening on a corporate card program, or you're doing bank-to-bank wires and transfers, and you're cutting checks and you're receiving invoices, and that's being processed in a different system. And you have people spending money on their personal cards, and you have an expense reimbursement system. So before you know it, it's a nightmare. You have like 5 or 6 different systems, and it's incredibly hard to manage. And over the last 5, 6, 7 years, it's become even harder because the pattern of spend in businesses has really changed, right? Like everything is a subscription, Everything is a recurring expense. So it's super hard to keep track of anything. And so we kind of centralize all of that into one platform. And surprisingly, that hasn't been done before, and at least done well. And so that's what Airbase does.
Great. And the company Airbase, you're headquartered in the Valley or in San Francisco?
So it is headquartered in the Valley, and it's a completely distributed team. I have folks in San Francisco. I myself live and work from Burlingame, which is about 15, 20 miles from San Francisco. And but I have a completely distributed team and multiple companies around the world.
You were telling me in the pre-interview, now you've got, 25 people or so. Tell us where some of these folks are based.
So, they're based in India, in Chile, in the Philippines. We have a new designer joining us in Singapore, and I only expect that to grow over time. Even in India, they're in about 5 or 6 different cities, in the north, in Delhi, and in the south, in Bangalore, Chennai, in Mumbai, all over the place.
So clearly you've made a conscious decision to structure it this way, which is interesting because your previous company, Automatic, which you built for 6 years and then sold to SiriusXM, was a centralized company. Walk us through how you made that decision. Obviously, a very different decision. It's a very different people strategy. Why did you decide to do it decentralized this time?
So it was a very deliberate, at least decision on my part. And with Automatic, it kind of de facto happened in such a way that we ended up building a team in one place, right? And there wasn't much thought put into it. At least I didn't spend a lot of time thinking about some of the downstream effects of building a team in a distributed way versus all in one place. And even back then, when I started working on Automatic in early 2011, and as we started building up the team throughout the 6-year journey, it wasn't as hard and to build teams out here in Silicon Valley, right? It's only gotten worse and more competitive and all of that over time. And we just started on that journey of putting a team together. We were in San Francisco. We started hiring everybody in San Francisco. But it was only as I went through that journey that I realized just how hard it is, both from the perspective of attracting really high quality people, especially if you have a high bar for the quality of the team that you want to build, so does everybody else, right?
So
And
this was really out of necessity. Just the sheer availability of talent in Silicon Valley led you to say, well, how can I get more talent? Let's open it up beyond the walls of the Valley.
So there are two big reasons I kind of, I'm taking a different approach this time. One is just the availability of talent and the competition that you don't have to deal with, right? Because if you choose to have an office, and here, especially in Silicon Valley, you are drawing kind of a circle of say a 10, 15, 20-mile radius around your office, and that is the talent pool that you have access to. Because in the very early days, when you're less than 10 people, less than 15 people, it's going to be quite hard for you to convince somebody to uproot themselves and move across the country and come over to where you are. And so you are really looking for talent and then limiting yourself, right? Yep. And yes, there's a lot of density of talent here in Silicon Valley, but it's also extremely competitive. And you are limiting yourself to a number that lives in that kind of radius around your office. That's one reason. And especially when you go remote, the world is kind of your talent pool, right? And there are very smart people, talented people everywhere in the world. And all of them suddenly become available to you. That's one reason. And so a second reason I decided to kind of build a distributor team is just capital efficiency, right? Because Silicon Valley is incredibly expensive now, and it's only gotten more so over the years.
Just for the listeners, what kind of price difference do you see on talent? If you, just roughly speaking, if San Francisco is kind of 100%, are you able to recruit folks at 50 cents on the dollar, 30 cents on the dollar? Yeah. What do you generally see?
So, a 50% is easy, right? And without making too many sacrifices on the quality of the talent, actually without making any sacrifices on the quality of the talent, right? And, I always am very competitive, given the market in which somebody chooses to live, right? And so if somebody chooses to live in India and when you think about compensation for all of our Indian employees, it's very competitive for the Indian market. Yep. And think about every market that we hire in, we are, at the kind of the upper percentiles of where we stand in terms of being competitive in the market. And that is how we attract the best people in that market. But the reality also is that if you're not living in Silicon Valley, then your cost of living is very different. And that is the advantage that you now get in terms of capital efficiency as you're building the business over time, right? And so I was very deliberate in that thought process of, hey, how can I make sure that I get access to the best people, no matter where they are?
Yeah.
And I can do it in a very capital efficient way, which is the right thing, the right foundation to lay for the business as we grow.
Whereas the first business you started and ran Automatic, it was less of a conscious decision. You just kind of did it. And also, frankly, 2010, the labor market was not as tight as it is now.
Yep. And I actually tried in the early days of Automatic. By the time we got to about 6 or 7 people in San Francisco, I thought about, hey, maybe I should have a remote team. I started hiring 1 or 2 people. It failed catastrophically because the culture really gets defined very, very early, right? And so right when you are 4, 5, 6, 7 people, the person who was remote always felt like they weren't part of the team, and decisions were being made and things were getting thrown over the wall at them. And all of that just didn't work out. I just ended up getting them an H-1B and they ended up joining us in the San Francisco office. And so laying that foundation culturally for how you make a distributed team work, that needs thought. And you can't just retrofit it on one fine day when you're 50 people in one office, decide that you're going to hire everybody remote starting.
It's easier to do it from day one if it's in the DNA of the company from day one. So I'm going to push you really hard, Thejo, and try to understand how you've done this. So I know it's only been a couple years. Clearly, you're off to a great start. You just raised a massive round of venture capital from, was it Sutter Hill Ventures? Or first round capital.
Yeah, so we raised a series. And
doesn't come any better than first round. So clearly it's working. How have you been able to build a team of 25 people, keep them on the same page, aligned with a culture remotely? Most companies are not able to do it.
Yep. And look, I'm not going to sit here and claim as though I have figured it out and let me tell everybody else what the secret is, right? Because there is no figuring it out. And one of the things I did early on and continue to do to this day is I take every opportunity to speak with other founders and CEOs who have followed that same kind of pattern of building a distributed and remote team, right? And so, and I hear the same thing from everybody is that there is no one thing. There is no, bullet list of like 4 points or 5 points. You just do this and you will be very successful in building a remote company. It is, as with all things, when you build a company, you just stay on top of it. You watch things closely, see what breaks, you tweak things, you fix things, and you continue to work at it over time. But, and that is something we continue to do also, right? Because things break at every stage of growth of the company.
Sure.
And what used to work when you're 5 people stops working when you're 25 people, right? And so you're always watching and learning and tweaking and evolving. And of course, you want to make sure that the people you tend to bring on understand that, right? And want to be a part of that. And what I tell my teams also when I hire people is that let's not, kid ourselves that there are certain cons to everybody being remote, right? At the end of the day, like with everything else, it's a trade-off. And we just have to do a good job of finding the people who value the trade-offs and value the pros of working remotely and are okay with dealing with the cons. And the job of the recruiting process and the interview process and the hiring process is to filter for that and to make sure that the expectations are set about what the pros and cons are and that people are coming into it fully aware of what they're getting in.
So who is it not right for? Who will you not hire because you worry that they won't be successful in a distributed environment?
So, for example, typically we tend not to hire very young folks who are just out of college, for example, who need a lot of mentorship, who need a lot of hand-holding in that early part of their career. And that's harder to do when you're remote. It's possible, but it's a bit of an uphill kind of a journey, right? And so we tend to avoid that because, I would rather focus the energies of our most senior folks on, moving the business forward, right? And so we tend to kind of pay up and hire more experienced people who can work more independently, right? So that's one example of how we kind of filter for the kind of experience profile that we look for when we are building this remote team. Maybe at some point when we have more time, more resources and all of that, we can invest in kind of the mentorship and the support and all of that. But right now we're not doing that. And I would actually recommend to people who are just starting off their career to probably go into an office and to learn from people, learn from osmosis, spend time with more senior people. And a lot of fields are, it's kind of an apprenticeship, right? Like you are learning from people who have a lot more experience than you. And I would recommend that to them. But for a lot of other people, it totally works because they're at a stage in your life where they want the balance, right? Or maybe they live in a geographical location. For example, a bunch of my team in a place like Bangalore in India, asking them to go into an office in Bangalore is punishment, right? Like they would spend 3 hours on the road a day commuting because the traffic is so bad, congestion is so bad, and they love the fact that they get 3 hours of their day back, and I don't need them to work during that time. I'm like, relax, watch TV, read a book, spend time with family, do the thing that will give you work-life balance, and appreciate that.
And as the business has gone from 5 to 10 to 20, 25 people, have you found that it's getting easier or harder to manage the remote nature of the business?
So that, it becomes easier in some ways, it becomes harder in other ways, right? So it's harder in the sense that you have to really stay on top of process, right? You have to really stay on top of how you do goal setting. How do you make sure everybody is aware of the direction in which the entire company is moving in so that nobody feels left out? And how do you make sure that the overall planning process is well defined and the cadence of how things are communicated, all of that you have to pay a lot more attention to. And we've done that. Like, we have actually learned that being remote has made us a lot more disciplined because it forces you.
You don't have a choice but to be clear about your communication, clear about priorities. I'm sure you use a lot of technology tools to do that.
Yep.
When you fast forward and you think about, okay, we're at 100 people, 200 people, what do you worry most about, despite putting all those things in place, that you think might break first in terms of communication or the culture?
Yeah, so look, the number one thing that I always is top of mind for me, that I'm always keeping an eye on, that and I know will be a challenge at every stage, is always when people are not connecting with each other in person, are they going to be able to build the bonds that will get us through tough times, right?
With each other, with each other.
Exactly, with each other, with the larger team, right? Are they going to feel a part of that larger team because they're not spending those moments together around the water cooler, they're not getting lunch together, they're not spending time together outside of work. And so we do things to kind of make that happen where, we have these weekly calls where people are randomly paired with each other and they get on a call for half an hour, they speak about anything but work, right? And they get to know each other as people, and they talk about their backgrounds and their hopes and dreams and passions and all of that, right? And so
that's an interesting idea.
Yeah, and so we do. By the way, it's not my idea. I can't take credit for it. Like I've done it before us, but that's actually a good idea because you tend to know a lot more about people across the company, and you build those relationships across the company. And there are things like that we tend to invest in, right? And so will that break when you are 300 people someday? Probably, but then you will likely figure out a different way of handling these things. Right?
A better way.
Yeah, what gives me the confidence is that other companies before us have done it and done it successfully. For example, I think there's a company called Envision, which has 800 or 900 employees around the world, fully remote, right? And then there's a company called Zapier, and I think they're also in the many hundreds of employees, if I'm not mistaken. There's a company called GitLab. And there are many, many companies like this now, and we are not really the pioneers in this, right? And so I don't actually feel like we're taking a huge risk here. I actually feel like other people have shown that it can successfully be done, and for some reason we can't figure it out. That's on us. Right?
And these are employees, just to be clear, right?
Yeah, and of course, I consider everybody to be an employee, but depending on where they are in the world, we might not always have a local subsidiary and a company in that market, so we might not be able to make an employee. And on paper, they might be a contractor, but for all intents and purposes, they are an employee, of the company, and that's how we do it.
So tell us a little about the recruiting process and the hiring process. You've obviously raised $8 million. You're going to be hiring, and I'm sure you are now. How do you interview folks halfway around the world? Just walk us through the key steps of the process.
So, for every role that we hire, and the most common roles are engineers, designers, product managers, and now we have salespeople, and we're hiring account executives and all of that, right? And so we really try to first define the interview process, right? So we actually start even before that by defining our values, right? And this is another big lesson that I took away from Automatic, and I really let the culture and values and all of that in Automatic evolve organically, right? And it was kind of really influenced by the people who came in. It's not that we had a bad culture, but it wasn't a culture that was deliberately shaped, right? That was tended to and cared to and all of that. But I'm trying to change that with Airbase. So one of the first things I did was write down our company values. Like, what do we care about and what do we not care about? It's not that our values are the right values, and if you don't agree with our values, you're wrong. It's just that, look, our values are our values.
Right.
Other people might have other different values. That's okay.
What's an example of one of them?
For example, on the engineering side, our engineering team, all the major teams also have their own values, right? And that's something we define. And one of the values of our engineering team is that pick boring technologies, right? So, when we build things, it is our belief as an engineering team that there is enough risk to go around in building a business that you don't want to kind of add to that by picking immature technologies and frameworks and languages and things like that. And that is our value, right? And so we pick a technology stack that includes technologies like Python and Java and frameworks like Django. And
you're not trying to be on the bleeding edge.
Exactly. And I can totally see how some engineers might look at that and go, I hate that. Like, my joy in engineering is to be on the bleeding edge, and I want to use the latest framework and programming language that was released last month, and that's what makes work fun for me. I get that, but in defining those values and making that a core part of our interview process, we can understand each other better and reduce the risk of things not working out because we didn't have that conversation up front, right? And so and that has been very successful for us in kind of attracting the right kind of people across the board. For example, the sales team just went through that exercise of defining their values. There are like 4 people in that team now, and we're hiring quickly. So that is a process that the sales team is going through now to evaluate every single person who comes in. So in terms of process, we have the interview process of the tactical thing of what's the first interview, what's the second interview, what's the third interview, what are we trying to evaluate for, and then the last step, usually once all of those tactical things are done and the skill match is figured out, the last interview is almost always, not almost always, it is always a cultural kind of an interview where we literally share our values, the company level values and the team level values with the candidate. And we just spend 45 minutes to an hour talking about it, right? Just
how do you talk about them in a way that helps you accurately assess the candidate's values versus them just, telling you what you want to hear?
No, look, that's a good question. And you try to dig into actual behavior in their past work, right? And you try to figure out how did they behave? What choices did they make, right? So obviously, if you ask the question, look, this is our value, agree or disagree, right? Then you're likely going to hear agree because that's what you want to hear, right? But what we try to rather focus on is not deliberately asking about a specific value, but talking about conversations at a high level. For example, one of our values is, it is strong opinions, weakly held, right? Like we want to make sure that, we debate, we kind of argue with each other. All of that is fine, but you should always be willing to give up a strong opinion in the face of data and change your mind, right? Yep. And that should not be a problem. And obviously the question then is not, hey, do you just agree with that value or not? It is, hey, let's talk about a time when you believed really strongly about something, but then you are ultimately proven wrong. Because that tells you something important about the personality of that person, is that are they willing to hear feedback? Are they willing to change their mind? Do they have a very big ego that does not let them change their mind or take feedback from everybody, from anybody?
Versus digging their heels in.
Exactly, right? Yep. And so that's a value we care about. And so it's a conversation primarily about, tell me about situations where you found yourself in a situation like this. Did that ever happen? How did you react to it? And kind of trying to put them in those kinds of situations and having them walk us through what's going on in their head and how they think about things, how they approach things, and what they think. Because there are never right or wrong answers to a lot of these questions, right? It's just here's my view of the world, right? Yep. Here's how I think about, how I should behave or anybody should behave in a given situation. And it's just a matter of then figuring out, hey, would this person being on our team allow us all then to focus on building the business? Or are we going to spend a bunch of time on unnecessary bullshit and the friction and arguments? And that's what you want to get rid of, right? And that's the answer we're trying to get to.
Got it. Fascinating. I give you so much credit because building a team is hard. Raising VC money and scaling a business is harder, and doing it virtually and remotely, decentralized, strikes me as the hardest. So I gave you a ton of credit. How can people learn more about the business or get in touch with you or just learn about Airbase?
So, you can just go to our website, airbase.io, and there's a lot of great information on our website about what we do. And even if you're not in the market for a spend management platform right away, feel free to reach out to me. I'm on LinkedIn. You can just look me up or reach out to me over there, and happy to connect and learn more about how people might be thinking about this problem in their own companies, right? And that's how I learn, and that's how our product and platform gets.
It was a real life issue for you, and that's how you decided to start the company.
Yep.
Great. Well, I again appreciate the time, Thejo. Thank you so much, and good luck with Airbase.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Thanks for having me.